This is a download from the BBC. To find out more and for our terms of use, please go to bbc.co.uk. Hello. So, England didn't win the right to host the World Cup. Was it because of a BBC own goal? Some were worried the Panorama corruption allegations about FIFA officials might affect the result. But others of you are more exercised about the amount of space BBC News is now giving to BBC stories, like this week's Panorama one. And Radio 4 versus Radio 1. Would you swap John Humphreys for Chris Moyles?
Yeah, for a week. But I'd cheat for any questions.
Not for an hour, let alone a week.
Never in a million years. Not if its bum was studded with diamonds, as my old mum used to say.
I take it that's a no then. I'll be talking to one avid Radio 4 fan who has gone where others fear to tread and swapped stations with her Radio 1 loving stepdaughter. Do they see each other in a new light? But first, a suspicion once smaller than a snowflake is building up into a flurry, even a small snowstorm. It can be summarised in this question. Why do I hear so much about the BBC itself instead of real news? For example, listener Margaret Leonard from Stockport emailed, wondering whether an interview with a File on 4 reporter last week on the Today programme was really just a glorified plug for her forthcoming slot. In recent weeks, news programmes have made space for items about the controversial BBC television drama The Accused, a BBC apology about a misleading World Service programme, and this week, of course, about a BBC Panorama programme which alleged corruption involving some of the FIFA officials about to vote on England's unsuccessful World Cup bid. Here's how Tuesday's Today programme reacted to the fallout from that Panorama report. First, the bulletins.
The delegation bidding to secure the 2018 World Cup for England has reacted angrily to a Panorama investigation which claimed 3 FIFA officials involved in deciding the host had accepted bribes in the 1990s.
Then a BBC executive gets a grilling.
It looks to a lot of people as though we've made the maximum impact with this programme, regardless of England's interest.
Look, Panorama's job is to investigate corruption and wrongdoing in public life.
Nobody would argue.
Then Gary Richardson has a go on the sports bulletin.
Some people will say that the timing was spot on, and many will say that no, it should have been broadcast a couple of weeks ago. But the key fact is, FIFA were told a couple of weeks ago, and they should have acted on the 10th of November.
Gary, if they had done what Sunday Times, who actually broadcast it, and then referred it, then they would have done football and sport a favour.
Yes.
And finally, 2 non-BBC journalists pick over the bones.
It's a fantastic journalistic story, which they did very, very well, and they seem to get it out absolutely as they should have done.
Henry Winter?
The timing clearly is pretty cynical on the eve of the World Cup.
I wonder how the staff of the BBC Sports Department reacted to the Panorama programme last Monday. Some listeners think the corporation should be about reporting more news from the outside world and less about the trials and tribulations inside Auntie. I spoke to Steve Mitchell, the BBC's Deputy Director of News, responsible for Panorama and the Today programme, to ask what happens when the BBC is in the eye of the storm and has to report on itself.
I think the BBC is a major national institution, and I don't think it's anyone would be able to argue it features much more in the national dialogue now than it ever used to when I first started with the organisation. And the BBC is a news story. Quite often it's a news story despite itself, and we reluctantly become part of a news story. And if the BBC is part of a news story, whether it's around events leading to the Hutton inquiry, whether it's around the Brand Ross affair, then it's up to us as BBC journalists to give our audiences the best coverage and the most objective coverage that we can manage of what are major stories and playing out on in the newspapers, on the breakfast tables of our audience.
How much are you concerned about the consequences of a story? Let's take the Panorama one on FIFA. The moment you got the information, you must have known this is an explosive story, both in terms of what it reveals and the timing. You must have known you're vulnerable to the accusation that you've just about, or you're in danger of torpedoing the bid to hold the World Cup. How do you prepare yourself for that? What precautions do you take?
With most of the best of our journalism, it has an impact, it has implications, and therefore we put it through a kind of sense check, a proportionate check. Is the journalism good enough? Is it strong enough? Can we stand by it? And will it merit the impact that it will have?
But can you understand the position of those people in the sports department in the BBC to see their own organisation perhaps scuppering the chances of getting the World Cup? Do you get any pressure from the journalists in the sports department?
I think there are as many opinions inside the BBC as there are outside about this question, Roger. And of course there are, healthy conversations, debates going on both within the BBC more widely and within BBC News and between news and sport. But I would point out that BBC Sport helped us roll out this programme, helped us put the programme onto news outlets.
Do BBC-generated stories get preferential treatment on BBC News?
If it's our original journalism, I wouldn't describe it as preferential treatment, but what we want to do is to get the best of that journalism to as many audiences as we possibly can, which means that we have to roll the story out in an appropriate form on different platforms, whether it's on Radio 2, Radio 4, BBC 2 or BBC 3 or online. The licence fee payer has invested hugely in the journalism that has gone behind that story or that programme, and we want to share it as widely as possible and get as much value out of it as possible for the licence fee payer and for the audience. But the second thing is, when that programme then generates a news story of itself, as in the case of the Panorama, which is a public controversy, then the BBC journalists have to step back and approach that story in as an objective way as they would with any other story generated anywhere else by any other organisation.
But I wonder if you've all got conflicting loyalties here. You, for example, as Deputy Director of News, are responsible for Panorama and Today, so you're responsible for the programme that produced the allegations in the FIFA issue. You're responsible for the Today programme that interviewed the editor of Panorama about those allegations. John Humphreys is a BBC journalist, sometimes uses the expression we in relation to the BBC. He's interviewing the executive editor of Current Affairs about the Panorama programme. I mean, people are going to be confused there. Do you expect, for example, in that circumstance, John Humphreys to ask as if the Panorama programme had nothing to do with the BBC and nothing to do with him?
I expect him to treat the Panorama story, which is, should the Panorama programme have been broadcast? Does the Panorama programme have an impact on the England bid? And should that matter? Those sorts of questions. John Humphreys, on behalf of the Radio 4 audience, should be asking those questions of the people who made the Panorama and scheduled the Panorama in as robust a way as he would ask questions of a programme made on Channel 4, for instance.
How will you feel if, at the meeting, FIFA decides the World Cup will not come to this country? The BBC will get a lot of flack for that, won't it?
I dare say there will be people who will hold the BBC to blame for that. There will be other people who are already saying that it's good that the BBC has done the journalism about this. But surely the position is that FIFA have a set of criteria against which they're going to take this decision, and being treated unfairly or badly or whatever it is they think has happened by the media in the country concerned is not one of the criteria by which they're making this decision.
Steve Mitchell, the BBC's Deputy Director of News. There is some BBC News that just about every Radio 4 listener will want to know. What plans does the new controller, Gwyneth Williams, have for her, well, perhaps their network? It's a question we asked you at the beginning of this series of feedback 2 months ago, shortly after Miss Williams' appointment. You weren't short of plans or ideas of your own, which I'd hoped by now, of course, to be able to put directly to Gwyn, as her friends call her. But so far she stayed away from our warm and welcoming studio, newly decorated with flowers in her honour, artefacts of South Africa where she was brought up, fresh croissants, newly ground coffee, and copies of serious foreign affairs and international development magazines, which she's rumoured to eat for breakfast. Gwyn Williams, note the Gwyn, will be joining me in the first programme of the next series of feedback at the end of January. I'm saving up your suggestions for her until then. Here are a few to whet your appetite. We'll start with Malcolm Mort from Liscard in Cornwall, who's got an idea for scheduling BBC Radio 7, also Miss Williams' responsibility, inspired by that calm morning on Radio 4 a few weeks back, when a strike meant news programmes were replaced with archive material.
I love the Wash. I think it's one of the last great wildernesses in the UK, a really special place.
When Today was off the air recently, I too heard that wonderful programme about the wash, and then I began to wonder how many of these radio gems must lie languishing in the radio archives. And then it occurred to me that surely the place for such programmes to resurface is on Radio 7. Just how is the schedule for Radio 7 decided? Well, I should like to suggest that listeners are given some democratic control over this. If programmes in the archives are listed on the website, then we'd be able to let the controller know what we'd like to hear again. So could the person who remembered the existence of that programme about the wash please be asked to make up a list of such gems, or even maybe take control of the Radio 7 schedule?
My name is Andy Campbell. I've seen a noticeable absence of any serious investigation of our shared culture within Europe. If you review the Radio 4 schedules, you'll find many references to American culture and politics. There's even Americana to further inform listeners about the United States. But where are the programmes about our closer cousins in Europe, which, after all, we're both geographically and politically a part of?
Hello, my name is Carol Steptoe and I'm from Stafford. We get a lot of programmes dealing with the arts and the media, and I think that we could do with a focus on industry as well. The Farming Today programme looks at the farming industry, but it's hidden away in the early hours. Occasionally science programmes look at new processes in manufacturing, but very rarely do we get anything about industry in general.
Keith Carter. Will the new controller be brave enough to tackle Woman's Hour? Thousands of us males have had to listen during a prime time slot when we're travelling around the country. As we're now equals, can't we just share the programme with half an hour for men?
Well, if you've got any other ideas for the controller of Radio 4, you can still contact feedback while we're off the air about anything you've heard on BBC Radio. You can leave a message for me anytime on 03 333 444 544. Standard landline charges apply, but it could be more expensive on some mobile networks. Or if you want to write, it's feedback. PO Box number 67234, London SE1P 4AX. All those contact details are on the feedback pages of the Radio 4 website. You provide the bullets and I will fire them. Now, the BBC is always saying it wants to consult you and hear your views. But is there really any point in giving them? Will it make any difference? Will your email even be read? By the way, just to reassure you, every letter, email and tweet that's sent to feedback is read, and every phone message is listened to. And of course, as often as possible, we'll pass on your thoughts directly to those responsible. But how much does your opinion actually influence important decisions anyway? Is there any point, for example, in becoming a member of one of the BBC's regional audience councils? Wendy Andrews is the chair of the council which covers the East of England. She says there is a point in joining up and that such councils do have an impact. Wendy Andrews, what's the point of the regional audience councils?
Well, the audience councils are there to really give the BBC Trust a range of views from audiences around England and also from Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland.
But you can't take decisions.
We're not a decision-making body, no. We are there to give advice, to influence, to inform.
You see, some cynics would say you're consulted after decisions are taken, and that actually there's not a lot of point to it. So you're window dressing for the BBC.
Yeah. Well, I would strongly disagree with that. I mean, that really isn't...
You've never dressed any windows for them, no?
That's not justified. In fact, the audience councils are always part of the consultation before the BBC Trust makes decisions and before they then take them to the BBC executive. So,
but can you point to a decision where the fact they've talked to you in advance has materially affected what has resulted?
Yes, I can. I mean, the BBC audience councils were very involved in discussions about, a few years ago, about the news being perceived as being a bit too London-centric. We fed in our views. A report went to the BBC Trust, and the BBC Trust took that on board. And as a result, I think if we were to look at news now compared to, say, 2 or 3 years ago, you'd see a real difference, actually.
But the government, for example, wouldn't consult you, though, on the question who should be the next chair of the BBC Trust. We understand a shortlist has been drawn up. But neither you nor anybody else, presumably, will be consulted about it.
I don't think it's the role of the Audience Council to get involved in decisions about who's going to run the organisation. We are there to be a group of people who represent licence fee payers, and I don't think it's at all for us to get involved in the running of the BBC.
Now, if somebody wants to get involved in an Audience Council, how much work is involved? How many meetings do you have to go to? How much homework, if you like, do you have to do?
We have 6 meetings a year. A pile of papers comes in the post. before the meeting, so you're expected to read them and sort of make sure you understand what we're going to be discussing. We also do 2 public meetings a year where we go out to the public. So just last month, for example, in the east of England, we had a meeting in Milton Keynes with people over 55 to get their views on BBC Online.
Well, let's look at the big issues coming up, because we've just been through the most extraordinary period where a whole range of decisions have been taken about the BBC licence fee and so on. What do you see as the big issues coming up where you should have and will have an impact?
I think that the question, actually the big question, is precisely what you've just referred to, the licence fee. The audience councils, we will expect to be consulted about what changes there are going to be. And
but for example, a big thing that worries a lot of people is the fact the BBC World Service in a couple of years' time will then be funded from the licence fee. Will you have a say on that?
I would expect that anything that is going to fall out from the licence fee settlement in terms of changes to what services the BBC provides, what programmes are broadcast, where the priorities are, the audience councils, yes, we will expect to be consulted because that's part of our role. That's what we're there for within the BBC Charter.
So if Wendy Andrews and her council colleagues don't have a say in the appointment of the new BBC Trust Chair, a truly vital appointment, particularly at this turbulent time, then who does? Well, not the BBC's management for a start, nor existing trust members, nor MPs, nor you and me, the licence fee holders who paid for the corporation. No, it's a job for someone who is not obliged to pay for a licence, though I think she would be able to find the money. It's Her Majesty the Queen, apparently, although it's rumoured she does get some help from ministers at the Department for Culture, Media and Sport. By the way, if you would like to become a member of the BBC's regional audience councils, please go to the BBC Trust's website, where you'll find a link and a questionnaire. Now, can you hear me, Mother? I mean, properly. If you're one of the 25% of listeners tuning in digitally, I might be cutting out here and there. Last week I talked to the BBC's Director of Radio, or rather Audio and Music, Tim Davey. I raised your concerns about the current Christmas advertising campaign on the BBC and some commercial stations, which is aimed at getting more people to buy digital radios. Here's what some of you thought of that interview.
My name's Mike Hannaford, and I was listening to feedback last week, and I heard a gentleman defending DAB. I just wanted to say I think DAB is still not ready because reception in my house drops out every evening, and I have to switch back to the FM band, so I don't think DAB is going to have a successful future, and probably the plug should be pulled on it.
This is Rosemary Payne. In rural Devon, I can't get DAB at all reliably. In theory, according to the postcode, I should be able to, but I just can't, so I'm stuck on FM.
It's the government's target to double the amount of people listening digitally within the next 2 years, and it aspires to have all the country switch over to digital by 2015. A politically dangerous target. A switch over means that all your analogue sets would be switched off at the same time. David Miller got in touch to say that friends of his who work in commercial radio are very sceptical about the future of digital radio. In fact, he says many industry insiders say DAB stands for dead and buried. Well, the Christmas advertising campaign is facing what could be a mortal challenge from some commercial radio stations, who are considering mounting their own distinctly negative advertising campaign, with the strapline, a DAB radio may be for Christmas, but might not be for life. Leading the charge is William Rogers, who is the Chief Executive of UK RD, a company which represents a number of local commercial radio stations. And he thinks the current campaign is misleading listeners by failing to make clear that not all of you can get a good signal. And that's not the only problem. Many of you emailed feedback at bbc.co.uk with your responses, mostly bad, but some good. Martin Johnson turns up the volume.
When I listened to FM, I worked from home, and the signal was appalling. Everything. There was nothing good about it, really. My children brought me a digital radio at Christmas 4 years ago, and ever since then it's changed everything. It's absolutely superb.
Right, what are you getting your mum for Christmas?
A kettle.
Oh, not another one. She's got enough to open a shop.
Kettles are us.
Not this year, they're not. Get her a digital radio instead.
I love digital radio, especially Radio 7. I bought a digital radio for my father. He lives in Dumfries, where the signal is good, and I get good signal in London and Folkestone. It's a fantastic service.
Michael Hingston. I'm from Welwyn Garden City. In all the discussions I've heard about digital radio, no one mentions car radios. You can't even talk about switch over from analog to digital until every new car comes with a digital receiver.
Plus, you'll be able to find her favourite station at the touch of a button.
Do you think she'd do that?
Yep, every time she puts the kettle on.
I'm Wolf James. I have a little tiny radio. It uses only one AAA cell, and it will run for at least 8 hours. In comparison, my digital radio, when I did try it with batteries, it would only run for an hour and a quarter. If I was an all-powerful dictator, I would force all proponents of digital radio to use only digital radios powered by batteries until they give up that silly idea.
Digital radio, more to love.
Now, for all you Radio 4 heads out there, would you swap your beloved station for Radio 1 for a week? For nothing? That's what Radio 4 fan Heather Dontonville and her Radio 1 loving stepdaughter Jenny agreed to do for the Feedback Radio Swap Challenge. Some listeners think they're bonkers. Among the many posts on the Radio 4 Facebook page, honourable mention goes to Andrew Stagg, who listens from Kazakhstan, and who said he'd rather be forced to walk naked through the wolf-infested steppe of that land, with bits of raw meat dangling from him, than listen to Radio 1. Back to the radio swap. How did it go? Here are some excerpts from Heather and Jenny's audio diaries.
You're listening to Today on BBC Radio 4 with Justin Webb and James Naughty.
I woke up listening to the Today programme, but I did have to make a bit more of an effort to get out of bed because usually I have Chris Moyles and Comedy Dave on in the background, which makes me ready for the day ahead. But today I woke up listening to a piece on domestic violence, which wasn't the most cheery thing to wake up to.
People who abuse their partners could be banned from their own homes for
So, this radio swap began last night. I woke up to Radio 1 this morning.
Good morning, people of Britain.
The music was fine, I quite liked some of it, but I do miss feeling informed in the morning, because I find news beats a bit sketchy.
Newsbeat. Also coming up...
The most interesting thing on Radio 4 was the news, because it was a lot more in-depth than Newsbeat. It did come in handy at college, so Radio 4 does have its uses, but I really miss the selection of music that gets played on Radio 1.
Album, You've Come a Long Way, Baby. Awesome album from Fatboy Slim.
Well, it's day 2 of the radio swap. I'm still missing proper in-depth news coverage. What I've heard on Newsbeat so far seems to be completely domestic news and focuses on issues that are going to be of interest to younger listeners, things like the student protests and the snow. But the rules don't prevent me visiting the BBC News website or reading my Archer's daily email.
I'm enjoying the Archers still, and I caught the 7 o'clock programme this evening, so it's a bit of a swap for Heather, so I tell her what's going on and she tells me what's going on Radio 1.
It was weird to have my dad in. So odd, because your dad was in this morning, wasn't he? He was. So weird.
Part of the Relationships Week on Radio 1 this week, each presenter is bringing in a member of their family. And Greg James had his father Alan in with him, and that is not something you hear on Radio 4. So I enjoyed that.
Again.
You're no son of mine.
Unbelievable.
Hello, it's Jenny on day 3 of the radio swap. I've done some homework whilst listening to a Radio 4 podcast of Women's Hour, which is quite interesting. The subjects were a little random, but it was all right.
I promise. Now, the Labour leader Ed Miliband went back to work this week after...
Nearly done. Today is the last day of the radio swap, and to my surprise, I made a point of listening to the Greg James show. I was very surprised. The first thing I heard was Take That. Wasn't I listening to them on Radio 1 18 years ago?
Greg James.
To say Radio 1 is detached from current affairs is something of an understatement. I've really learned this week, loud and clear, that it just is all about entertainment.
It's always been a clash.
We've got that as well.
Or have you?
Yeah.
And that is just one reason why I will be deliriously happy to get back to Radio 4.
Well, I spoke to Heather and Jenny myself to make sure all was well in the Dontonville household again after their forced separation from their beloved stations, and to find out what they'd missed the most. Heather, how was it for you? Was it cold turkey or a cascade of new sensations?
It was probably slightly more the latter, actually. It was definitely lots of new sensations, some more interesting than others.
Do you feel deprived of news? Was it a news desert, Radio 1?
Yes, in a nutshell, it really was. Yeah, I feel very deprived of news. I've watched much more TV news than I do normally in the last week.
How about Jenny? For you, was it as bad as you feared? I mean, you exhibited little enthusiasm for this last week for Radio 4.
It's not as interesting as I thought it would have been. I'm not politics or current affairs really. I'm more music, which I really did miss.
Heather, you talked about missing the news, but there is Newsbeat, of course, on Radio 1. Did that give you what you wanted?
Well, what I noticed in the earlier part of the week was that all the news I heard seemed to be entirely domestic and very much orientated towards the younger age group. But I didn't hear anything to begin with about the Queen's trip to the UAE or the situation in Korea. And I was quite surprised by that. But then later on in the week, I did hear a little bit more international news, and it amused me. I heard about the gay pride marches in India, and I don't know if Radio 4 would have covered that in quite the same way.
You liked Greg James, didn't you? I think he brought his dad in as part of a relationships week. Why did that appeal?
Oh, I loved that. I enjoyed the nature of the questions and just the relationships between them. It was a really warm moment. It was lovely.
Now, Jenny, I'm told that you did make a surprising discovery. You have a passion for the Archers. Is that true?
Yeah, I traded what was going on in the Archers, and Heather told me what was number one on the chart show.
Well, looking for some lessons that can be learnt from this, Radio 4 is desperate for people of your age, Jenny. So, on the whole, what do you think they're going to have to do to really attract you? Because on the basis of a week's sampling, I don't think you're that keen to switch on again, are you?
I'd be more keen if there was stuff like the Archers, and because the Archers is like EastEnders or something like that. The comedy part of it was interesting as well. So I think if Radio 4 did a bit more comedy, and it might engage teenagers more.
And Heather, how about you? Any advice for Radio 1?
Oh, I should think Radio 1 should just keep doing what it does best, which is providing a huge amount of entertainment for a lot of people. You know, I think really if people like me want to listen to in-depth news coverage and a lot of drama and current affairs and so on, well, they should just go and listen to Radio 4 because that does that so perfectly.
And Jenny, have you heard your stepmother humming anything round the house that she wouldn't have heard before?
Yes. She liked the Fatboy Slim bit. She thought that was interesting, and she started humming to a bit more music than she usually does.
So you got an idea for a Christmas present?
Oh, I wouldn't put it that far, no.
Let's hope the controllers were listening. You won't be able to listen to another edition of Feedback until late January when we return, having been promised that none of the BBC radio networks will transmit anything controversial until we're back on the air, and that no presenter will make a cock-up. But please keep on listening and writing to us, because they will. They can't help it. I'm off back to my hometown of Berkhamsted, where I'm going to buy Ed Reardon a drink at the old mill and help him with his writer's block. Ed's a bit down, understandably, because I really do think he's the BBC's unsung hero of journalism. From this branch of the British broadcasting castration, goodbye.
Cheat for any questions? Not for an hour, let alone a week.
Never in a million years, not if its bum was studded with diamonds, as my old mum used to say.
I take it that's a no, then. I'll be talking to one avid Radio 4 fan who has gone where others fear to tread and swapped stations with her Radio 1 loving stepdaughter. Do they see each other in a new light? But first, a suspicion once smaller than a snowflake is building up into a flurry, even a small snowstorm. It can be summarised in this question. Why do I hear so much about the BBC itself instead of real news out from that Panorama report? First, the bulletins.
The delegation bidding to secure the 2018 World Cup for England has reacted angrily to a Panorama investigation which claimed 3 FIFA officials involved in deciding the host had accepted bribes in the 1990s.
Then a BBC executive gets a grilling.
It looks to a lot of people as though we've made the maximum impact with this programme, regardless of England's interest.
Look, Panorama's job is to investigate corruption and wrongdoing in public life.
Nobody would argue.
Then Gary Richardson has a go on the sports bulletin.
Some people will say that the timing was spot on.
This is a download from the BBC. To find out more and for our terms of use, please go to bbc.co.uk. Hello. So, England didn't win the right to host the World Cup. Was it because of a BBC own goal? Some were worried the Panorama corruption allegations about FIFA officials might affect the result. But others of you are more exercised about the amount of space BBC News is now giving to BBC stories, like this week's Panorama one. And Radio 4 versus Radio 1. Would you swap John Humphreys for Chris Moyles?
Yeah, for a week. But I'd...
For example, listener Margaret Leonard from Stockport emailed, wondering whether an interview with a File on 4 reporter last week on the Today programme was really just a glorified plug for her forthcoming slot. In recent weeks, news programmes have made space for items about the controversial BBC television drama The Accused, a BBC apology about a misleading World Service programme, and this week, of course, about a BBC Panorama programme which alleged corruption involving some of the FIFA officials about to vote on England's unsuccessful World Cup bid. Here's how Tuesday's Today programme reacted to the fallout.
And many will say that, no, it should have been broadcast a couple of weeks ago. But the key fact is FIFA were told a couple of weeks ago and they should have acted on the 10th of November.
Gary, if they had done what Sunday Times, who actually broadcast it and then referred it, then they would have done football and sport a favour.
Yes.
And finally, two non-BBC journalists pick over the bones.
It's a fantastic journalistic story, which they did very, very well, and they seem to get it out absolutely as they should have done.
Henry Winter?
The timing clearly is pretty cynical on the eve of the World Cup.
I wonder how the staff of the BBC Sports Department reacted to the Panorama programme last Monday.